I declare open this hearing of the Select Committee on Energy Planning and Regulation in Australia. I begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. These are public proceedings, being video streamed live via the Parliament's website, and a Hansard transcript is being made. I remind all witnesses that in giving evidence to the committee, they are protected by parliamentary privilege. It is unlawful for anyone to threaten or disadvantage a witness on account of evidence given to a committee, and as such may be treated by the Senate as a contempt. Witnesses before parliamentary committees cannot be sued or prosecuted for giving evidence or for the content of the evidence they give. It is also a contempt to give false or misleading evidence to a Senate committee. Witnesses also have a right to request to be heard in camera. If a witness objects to answering a question, they should state the ground upon which the objection is made, and the committee will determine whether it will insist on an answer, having regard to the grounds on which the claim is made. If the committee determines to insist on an answer, a witness may request that the answer be given in camera. Commonwealth officers appearing today are also reminded of the Senate order specifying the process by which a claim of public interest immunity should be raised. A copy of the order is available from the Secretariat. Before I welcome out, I guess I'd say that the committee is, and the Senate more generally, is thrilled at the credible level of participation that it's received from people who are giving evidence as witnesses and or putting in submissions. The high level of academic experience, knowledge, is some of the best I've ever seen in a Senate committee. And given the tight timeframes, I thank everyone for all the work that they've put in at such a great rate of knots. And on that, to welcome two of our esteemed academics, I'd now welcome Professor Michael Brear from University of Melbourne, who I believe is online, and Dr Dylan McConnell from the University of New South Wales, who is here before us today. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and protection of witnesses giving evidence to the Senate committees has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, will you please state your full names and the capacity in which you appear today?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Dr Dylan McConnell. I'm a Senior Research Associate from the University of New South Wales, and I'm representing the collaboration on energy and environmental markets from UNSW.
Thank you, Dr McConnell. Professor Brear, are you with us?
Can you hear me, Senator Van?
I can. Can't see you, but I can hear you.
I'm having problems with my video. It worked 5 minutes ago before I went live on WebEx with yourself, but I don't know what's happening. But you can hear me. I apologise.
No problem.
My name is Michael Brear, Professor of Mechanical Engineering at the University of Melbourne.
Thank you, Professor. I now invite each of you to make a short opening statement, and at the conclusion of any remarks, I will invite members of the committee to ask questions. Professor Brear, do you want to go first? Or do you have an opening statement?
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much. I first note that I appear virtually today as an individual and not on behalf of my employer or others. But I'll summarise my submission and my contributions in today's hearing as follows. If we'd arise to the immense challenge of the energy transition in the coming decades, Australia will need to excel at integrated energy system planning and implementation on a truly national scale. This has two related, necessary and urgent conditions for success. The first is the need to establish comprehensive energy system planning, and the second is the need for several institutions to implement that planning. There's just one comparison. Australia's current domestic electricity system, which is a significant part of your terms of reference, built 5.9 gigawatts per annum of renewables and battery capacities between 2019 and 2023. The Net Zero Australia project that I've been involved in projects that to get to net zero by 2050, we need to build about 16 gigawatts per annum from today to get to net zero, or about 4.4 gigawatts per annum of new build from today if we do not intend to achieve significant abatement and just meet rising demand that results from population growth. So, even excluding exports, we must still roughly triple current build rates of renewables and firming, whilst implementing many other significant measures if we are to make significant progress. We will fall far short of net zero by 2050 if we continue at close to current build rates. And that finding is important when we're considering any part of our energy system, as this inquiry does. Now, the Commonwealth's net zero plan, I think is fair to say, is a work in progress. And again, this inquiry only covers part of the net zero plan's remit. But the net zero plan, hasn't yet stated how it will address the need for hundreds to thousands of billions of additional investment, how we would identify the required technologies and innovations, and that includes how do we rigorously determine whether we do or don't need technologies that are controversial for some or not permitted by current policy, determination of how many people we'll need by skill and location, and determination of who will undertake this planning, how its scope will be set, and how it will be reviewed by governments, the community and industry. A comprehensive plan needs that. Then, focusing more specifically on the terms of reference of this inquiry, if we are to make significant progress, we need to expand our ability to implement significant measures both outside and inside what I would call the Australian domestic electricity and natural gas systems that this inquiry considers. So within this inquiry's terms of reference, these agencies that are named in the TOR will have to implement numerous measures at an unprecedented rate, and they include new market and system rules that accommodate new technologies or accommodate existing technologies in new and improved ways, approvals to connect new assets at much faster rates than historically, including some that are essential at the system level but which would not pass current investment tests, enhanced protections for energy consumers, particularly low to middle income earners and industrial energy users, and new means of working with and supporting First Nations and regional communities, and finally new measures for maintaining public safety and environmental protection, particularly as new technologies become widespread. So whilst I don't have the answer to this question, my question I would pose to governments at state and federal levels is how can this collection of agencies and their processes be redesigned and resourced such that rapid progress is more likely? Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Breer. Dr McConnell.
Thank you, Senator. So as mentioned earlier, I'm part of the Collaboration on Energy and Environment Markets at the University of New South Wales. We are in the process of finalising a submission to this inquiry, and I'll aim to reflect the general themes within that draft, and I apologise for not having that prepared ahead of today's appearance. So the university's Centre Collaboration on Energy and Environmental Markets is an interdisciplinary research group that focuses on the design, analysis and monitoring of energy and environmental markets and associated policy frameworks. We bring together expertise, particularly with distributed energy resources or consumer energy resources, as they are more increasingly known as, and have a commitment to open source data, open source software processes in our analysis to support research and transparent policy analysis, among a range of other activities within our group. So our submission has two main strands. One is around the suitability of the existing institutional and governance arrangements, or perhaps lack thereof, as the case may be, and secondly around introducing or improving the openness and accessibility of the NEM's primary planning process, the Integrated System Plan. So on the first point, and without going too much into the backstory and the history, the current settings are very much, they're almost 25 or more than 25 years old. They're a product of competition reforms of the 90s, and they are based on a very highly prescriptive set of rules for a market system with a fairly slow and steady process for reforming those rules. And that process was perhaps suitable for the time, or suitable for incremental change, or slow and steady change with predictable changes to any settings that would not deter investment, and with the premise that the national electricity market, the competitive wholesale electricity market, I should say, is fundamental to the investment and operation of the electricity system, and that those competitive wholesale electricity markets would be largely driving investment and investment decisions. At the time, the establishment of these settings, climate change and emissions reductions were not as significant priority as they are today, and also there was, I guess, different technology expectations. This was, we had a largely coal and gas and hydro-dominated system, and the proliferation of rooftop solar that we see today was certainly not imagined by the original designers of the system. Since as a result of the substantial changes we have seen in technology costs, and also the increased emphasis on emissions reductions, this has put a lot of strain on this particular governance settings and arrangements, and this is we've basically seen limited change in the rules and the regulatory frameworks that set the boundary of the national electricity market, and that has led to a range of challenges, and the consequences of those challenges has been increased government intervention, particularly from state governments, but also increasingly the Commonwealth in the last 6+ years, essentially since 2016, and the System Black event in South Australia. We've seen a large expansion of state intervention into this system that was predicated on, I guess, a market-led investment decisions rather than state-based activities. There has been essentially an implicit, if not in some cases explicit, loss of faith in the current settings, and we need to really, I guess, update our governance arrangements to reflect the current realities of the current system and the situation in which we find ourselves today. So, on the second point, we have within our research group and more broadly a commitment to open source principles, and like to promote these across a range of activities. And we see this as important in improving trust in planning processes, and also quality and reproducibility of research. Having open data and open source software has significant benefits in the transparency and accountability of some of these planning processes, and we're actually seeing a broader adoption of these kind of approaches internationally. In the European Union, there is increasing reliance on, or recommendations to use open source software and open data in similar processes that we have in Australia. In the United States, we have their major National Renewable Energy Laboratory has a library of open source tools that they increasingly use for different planning processes. But we in Australia, have a dominance of a particular modelling framework that has some risks of introducing a sort of analytical monoculture where everyone is using the same thing and everyone ends up with the same results. So to that end, our sort of key recommendations from our submission are for an independent review of the institutional arrangements, and in particular integration of consumers and the demand side into those institutional settings, and then finally align planning activities with essentially open source software and open data principles. And with that, I'll leave it to you.
Thank you, Dr McConnell. I would also just like to advise that representatives of the media have requested permission to film and take photographs of the committee's proceedings, and the committee. Do I have agreement from the committee that that's okay? That's okay. Thank you, sir. I might start with some questions for you, Dr McConnell. I know one of your areas of expertise and excellence is in governance around energy systems planning and the like, and regulation. You mentioned that you weren't sure whether or not one of your recommendations was a review of the market bodies as they exist today, AEMO, AEMC and AER. Where do you think that review would best be held? At a productivity commission? How deep or how large do you think it needs to be?
So, two parts to that. I think it's hard to do this review in isolation from what might happen in the post-2030 world. There is at least discussion about a post-2030 market design or market review, and it would make sense to do the review of the governance arrangements in the context of that review. In that sense, because the governance arrangements may be informed, or vice versa, by that review. There is some synergy and interplay between those two things. Productivity Commission would not be a bad choice. I don't have a strong opinion on that. I think the main thing is that it needs to be independent of the current market institutions. That's the key. It could even be, we've had independent reviews of these in the past. We had the Vertican review in 2015. Some kind of completely independent review may be appropriate. But yeah, I don't have particularly strong views on that, other than it should be at arm's length and independent from the existing market institutions.
I think a very good point. You mentioned two things. The often talked about 2030, post-2030 market review. Do you think waiting till then is too long? And I will admit that was part of the reason for you standing up this committee and this inquiry was, do we have 5 or so years to wait to try and improve the situation, or is it more urgent than that?
Look, I think it's more urgent, but also I'm cognizant of the ability to actually do anything within those timeframes. I think about the 2030. 2030 is 5 years away. If we start today on a significant reform and review of market arrangements and governance arrangements, if we were lucky, it would be ready by 2030. Even though 2030 is 5 years away, starting right now, I think is important. And it's not. I'm not suggesting this is a question that should be kicked down the road, or it's something we should do today. But I'm just cognizant of the time it takes to do such things and how long these things take in the past. And I guess also there are some risks around if scaring investors or putting off different stakeholders if you do a wholesale change very quickly right now. There are also risks if we don't get this right. So I think we need to be looking at this as soon as possible, but with a view to actually implementing some change, whatever that may be, in the 2030s.
Thank you. And yes, correct. I don't think everyone can stand up an inquiry as quickly as this committee did. So you mentioned also that as well as the generation, transmission and storage part of the marketplace, you mentioned consumers and other CR. Do you think at the moment the planning regulation part of it is almost silent on that consumer side, that behind the meter side of our energy system? Because after all, it is still part of our energy system.
Yes. It is, and it has been. It's been something that's been, I guess, critiqued as missing from the energy market arrangements or processes since its inception. Almost, the 2002 PARA review identified that the demand side, activity on the demands, progressing activity on the demand side was behind, and I think the same can be said today, 22 years later. And that is a product, I think, of a supply-side focus of AEMO, but also the institutional arrangements that establish the existing setup. The extent of, we've got over 3 million rooftop solar systems across Australia, a lot of participation from consumers that was not really envisaged, well, certainly not as is, how it is currently occurring. That was not envisaged by the original system designers and planners. And so in some respects, it's not surprising that our governance arrangements and processes are not well suited to, or are currently not well suited to that. It is a big disappointment that it hasn't progressed that side of things in the last decade as much as it should have. It's worth pointing out that there was a review of the ISP, and one of the recommendations around that was improving the integration of demand-side resources into that process. And just last week, I think, AEMO's published a methodology consultation document, and one of the points that they are directly consulting on is this part. But yeah, that has come sort of from a ministerial process rather than from the existing arrangements.
Because it's safe to say that side of it, particularly rooftop PV, sort of just seemed to surprise our market bodies, but it's been coming on very quickly over a number of years, and they still haven't been able to keep pace with it, even though it's contributing such a large part of electricity generation in the market today.
Yeah, and expected to increase to contribute a very large part of the system in the future as well, and that's worth keeping in mind. Actually within the integrated system plan projections, distributed energy resources and distributed batteries actually play a very significant role, and the way that one of the criticisms of the ISP is how that is actually modelled and taken into account, and that may not reflect the real world sort of experience or how these things might play out in the real world.
Do you think, from a consumer point of view, primarily, but also just overall system costs, if all that's done properly and continues to grow at the pace it is, should we expect to see capital expenditure going on the supply side, as you called it? Do you think that might moderate, or do you think both will continue at a great rate of knots?
I think the answer is both. Well, both will need to in order to. I think Professor Breer pointed out the rate that we need to be growing our energy supply side just for business as usual. So it's not an either or, but even calling it the demand side is a bit problematic, because I was talking to colleagues about this morning. It is supply. It is it's a bit of a problematic term in itself, but the degree to which we do these activities on the consumer side, the demand side, however you frame it, should reduce costs and activity on the large scale centralised supply side as well. And that is not just generation; that is also transmission as well.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Breer. Given your work on the Net Zero Australia project, how would you assess that current planning is affecting or driving our change to a lower emissions economy?
So I make the distinction between planning of the entire economy and then planning of the national electricity and gas systems as per the TOR of this inquiry.
Just for clarity on that, Professor Brear, my reading of the terms of reference is we are talking about the energy, gas markets and delivery, electricity and gas market delivery and operational systems, if that helps clarify.
Certainly. But there is a need for a comprehensive plan that is wider than the TOR, and then the planning that's done in accordance with this inquiry should ideally be complementary to the broader effort. For example, Senator Van, the electricity generation and emissions associated with electricity generation and gas use, I think, are about 50 or 60% of our domestic greenhouse gas emissions. So therefore, what we need to do in the long term in those sectors relative to transport, relative to heavy industry, agriculture and so on, needs to be consistent. The planning that is currently done inside those two systems and consistent with the TOR exists within the ISP, but it also exists within several state agencies. For example, I can't remember all the acronyms. There's quite a few with each state, but several of the states have their own transmission planning at various stages of development. I don't think that planning that's consistent with your terms of reference has yet fully accommodated quite a few things, including the things that you're talking about with Dr. McConnell. So, for example, the consumer energy resources is one of them. There are others as well, though. Transport and what I would broadly define as industry. Now, industry includes agriculture, which I acknowledge are outside of your terms of reference, but also it includes the mining sector emissions and manufacturing emissions, broadly defined. So, for example, a cement manufacturer, which is a very large gas consumer typically, is inside your terms of reference. How they would decarbonise, how various types of mineral processing or smelting or other things, how they will decarbonise hasn't yet been fully planned for. And as part of that, the numerous things that I mentioned earlier on in my opening statement, the costs, the technologies, the people, and the review of those approaches hasn't yet been fully accommodated in that planning. I will just add one minor thing to Dr. McConnell's comment. I think right now about 25% of the installed capacity in Australia's electricity is rooftop solar. So that will continue to grow, as Dr. McConnell mentioned, but it's already a big number.
Very much so. I need to share the call around, Professor, but if I get time, I'll come back with some more questions. Senator Canavan.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to you both for coming along today. I might start with Professor, now was it Brear? Have I got that right? Yeah. Brear, thank you. I thought I heard you say in your opening remarks that that we need to build, was it 16 gigawatts of storage a year?
16 gigawatts of capacity, both renewables and firming.
Okay, but both renewables and that's why I wasn't sure. So, do you have a breakdown? How much of that is storage compared to just renewables?
I'll take that one on notice, Senator.
Okay, no worries.
It's mostly renewables in the scenarios we've considered, and all of that information is publicly available on the Net Zero Australia website.
Cool.
But I can find that out for you, Senator.
Okay, great, thanks. Just while I'm on the report, it's been a little while since I looked at it, and you mentioned this in your submission, the problems of land access. How much land is needed to build renewable energy? And maybe if I just add the next bit of my question in now, how much is needed for, is it, for want of a better word, reforestation, carbon sinks, etc.?
Well, if we consider only the domestic energy system, which is consistent with the terms of reference of this inquiry, I can't tell you off the top of my head the percentage of land use for renewable generation. But if we include the export energy system and make projections of how much clean energy we'll export, the land use is very substantial. But they're very uncertain around quantities. Once again, I can give you those numbers. I don't have those at my fingertips today.
Could you take that on notice?
Certainly.
Thank you. Just going to your submission, you've got a table on, actually your submission's not numbered, but it's page 4 of the PDF. It compares the cost, I think, net present value or presumably capital costs. Does this include OPEX as well? Can you see the table?
It does, CapEx and OPEX.
Okay, so total cost of no abatement target and the net zero scenarios. So I might say, just looking at the total NPV column there, am I reading this right, that the cost of net zero is between 2.1 or $4 trillion compared to a baseline of no abatement target?
Yes, that's right. But you'll see that additional cost is primarily in the export NPV column, not the domestic column. So the additional cost for the domestic decarbonisation task is between $500 and $800 billion, going from no abatement target to net zero. But in the export NPV, it's more substantial, and therefore the totals are more substantial. But the caveat there, the most significant caveat there, Senator, is that the export NPV assumes that we maintain current levels of energy exports on an energy basis and replace those with clean equivalents. That's, of course, a big assumption, Senator.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, otherwise we'll be much poorer as a country. So, with that in mind...
Sorry, Senator, I emphasise there as well is that the export costs should not be paid for by Australians. They should be paid for by the people who are buying the energy from us.
But those costs, the capital costs then of those programs, is $2.1 to $4 trillion cost, it amounts to $80,000 to $150,000 per Australian. Is that right? That's if we're 26 million people. That's a lot of money.
I haven't done that calculation.
Right.
I don't want to do it off the top of my head, but I do emphasise that the export system costs, as that 2.6 trillion that we would otherwise have in the counterfactual, should be paid for by long-term contracts with our export partners, not by Aussies.
Not sure they're stacking up as commercial at the moment, but even if you take the other figures, the domestic market figures of $500 billion to $800 billion odd dollar extra cost, that's $20,000 to $30,000 per Australian. Is that right?
Once again, I haven't done that calculation per Australian, but that $500 to $800 billion counterfactual, so the additional costs of getting to net zero over achieving nothing in terms of abatement, is there, and that's an additional cost of getting to net zero.
So, I mean, on your evidence and your modelling, it is a cost to the Australian public to meet a net zero target, clearly, on your numbers.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
And the thing for us is that I think we've been told, certainly in this place, we've been told by the so-called self-appointed experts that this was net zero is going to be a costless exercise. We certainly weren't told that it would be cost to the order of $20,000 to $30,000 per Australian. But I'm glad you've done this work, because no one's done it in here. Can I just ask, with these assumptions, with the net zero target in your modelling, how do you treat Scope 3 emissions? Are the emissions associated with the construction of batteries or solar panels that might occur in other countries? We import most of those, of course. Are they factored into in your modelling?
The answer is it depends, Senator. I'm sorry to give you that.
That's all right.
Typically complicated answer. The Scope 3 emissions, or the what we might call the embodied emissions of equipment that we import into the country, we have not considered. But in our export analysis, the emissions of the fossil fuels that we currently export, coal, both thermal and metallurgical, and LNG, we do include in the export abatement target.
Right. Okay. Yep. So that would be on that latter point. Is that, to try and use an example, is that, say, the emissions that are, or any emissions that are created through the use of, say, our hydrogen exports? Is that where you're going with that one, just to make it tangible for me?
For example, at the moment, we're a very large metallurgical and thermal coal and LNG exporter. Those fossil fuels, as we export them, create between, hang on one second, Senator, create between 1,200 and 1,300 million tonnes of CO2 emissions offshore, which is about 2 to 3 times our domestic emissions. So we're talking about in this analysis, and that's why our export NPV is so substantial for the, as you earlier noted, we're solving a very large export abatement challenge.
So
it's larger than our domestic abatement challenge.
Yeah, just to understand for me, your modelling is constraining or requiring those exports to get to net zero. That we'd have to get them down to being abated effectively.
We require both our domestic and our export emissions to get to net zero by mid-century. They are to some degree independent.
Yeah.
Well, they're actually independent constraints on our modelling, and we have done further analysis to separate those two out, hence our ability to show you disaggregated numbers for the domestic and export systems.
Sure. But I'm trying to understand here, if we import, say, solar panels to help create hydrogen,
Yes.
to make hydrogen, your model doesn't require, say, the solar panel factories of Xinjiang to operate on a net zero basis.
No, it does not, and formally that's an inconsistency in our modelling, Senator. But I would add that the energy and emissions required to make a solar panel are probably, over its lifetime, not a large part compared to the renewable electricity.
Except they're definitely smaller. But it is, as you say, they're just trying to establish that there's a slight inconsistency there.
It is.
Just going to, I've got your. I know you've produced lots of, and you've done excellent work. I should have said that up front. I've tried to read most of what you've done, but you've got so much. I'm sure I haven't covered it all. I'm looking at a report that you've done called Final Modelling Results, published in April 2023. On page 69 of that report, you've got a couple of charts, the title of which is Decarbonised Export System will cost 5 times more than reference case. I'm just trying to understand that. Is this mean that our customers of our energy would have to pay 5 times the cost for that energy relative to not achieving net zero?
I can't remember what slide is what on our many pages of slides, Senator, but I think you're right. From memory, if that slide is one looking at the cost of clean energy exports on an energy basis, so dollars per gigajoule, that is approximately right. We're finding that those clean energy commodities by mid-century are above $30 a gigajoule. When we first got those results, Senator, the war in Ukraine hadn't yet started, and we thought that was sobering, but then global commodity markets did their thing after the war in Ukraine, and even LNG went not too far below that for short periods. But compared to long-term costs of fossil exports to other countries, they are significantly higher. I would also add, Senator, we're doing further work on those questions, and we think, and I think it's an emerging consensus from other people working in this area that those costs are probably modelled to be too low. And more sophisticated.
You're saying it would be even higher than potentially 5 times?
I think they could be higher, yes, Senator, but our further work will confirm that.
Look, I really congratulate you for this transparency. It's very important. I mean, you might not be able to answer this. I have a little bit of cynicism with my experience in especially North Asia, of their willingness to pay 5 times, potentially more than 5 times, the cost of energy, even in developed countries like Japan. Certainly, though, developing countries like India, there's just, I mean, I don't know, it's just zero prospect of that. I'm not sure if you can comment on that. Maybe you haven't done that work about a willingness to pay for this from our customers.
We haven't, Senator, but the export energy system will ultimately, the scale of Australia's export energy system ultimately depends on who's willing to pay what for what we produce.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I do have some questions for Dr McConnell, but I realise you need to rotate the call, so if there's time, I'll come back. Thanks, Chair.
Senator Gosh.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. Professor Breer, can I just ask, following on from my colleague's questions around the table that you have, I think it's on either page 4 or 5, that we were just talking about, comparing no abatement targets and net zero scenarios. Did I understand your answer correctly in relation to the export column of that table, which is to say that that gap is anticipated to be paid by the export consumer, the consumers, that is, the importers of that energy overseas? And can I just ask about in the domestic NPV, and that's the first column, the no abatement target of 4.3, that's based on projected increases in domestic demand?
Includes projected increases in policy population as per ABS projections. That then translates to changes in demand. We have, of course, improved energy efficiency in all of our scenarios. So, for example, your house in 30 years' time will require hopefully a smaller air conditioner than it does today to achieve the same objective, for example. So we have included population growth and learning in all of the technologies in these supply chains. Also in the no abatement target, we include, and indeed all of these numbers, both what Dr McConnell referred to before as both the supply side and the demand side. So that includes a coal-fired power station or a wind farm, electricity transmission, distribution into the homes or our businesses or our heavy industry. And it also includes things like the cost of buying a new car, whether that's an internal combustion engine driven vehicle or an electric vehicle or some variation.
And so when that table is followed by these additional costs arise from numerous investments, is this the investment cost that we're talking about here?
These numbers they're all costs and they're all net present values of costs, so they're both capital and operating costs. As you transition to lower emission systems and ultimately a net zero system, you tend to find that your investments become heavily capital intensive. So, for example, today, if you were to build a brand new coal-fired power station, probably 3/4 of the cost of that whole power station over its lifetime would be the coal cost. Whereas if you were to build a wind farm today, about 80 to 90% of the total cost of that asset is the capital cost. But that's similar things occur if you buy an electric vehicle versus a gasoline fueled vehicle for your home. A gasoline car is mostly your fuel bill and a bit of capital, and the purchase and maintenance as well. An EV is mostly the capital cost of the EV and the running costs and your electricity bill are a smaller part of your total costs. So I could have split out equivalently a table that showed the changes in total capital costs of these different scenarios, but that then ignores the significant ongoing costs, particularly the costs of buying fossil fuels in the zero abatement target cases. But there is an additional capital intensity that we need to understand as we transition to low emission systems.
So there's a capital...
Similar things are also, sorry, Senator. No. Similar things also happen if we were to build nuclear power stations.
And so that's what you're saying is there's a high level of capital costs in the renewable options, but the input costs reduce significantly, and that's the difference between that and fossil fuels.
Well, the fossil fuel costs, of course, diminish because we use a lot less of them.
Of course. Now, can I just ask, this modelling that you've referred to, that's not modelling the current government's policies, is it? It's basically an independent model.
Completely independent of any government effort. So we've set for the domestic energy system, we started this project in 2021, and when we did that, we set our
and that was when the government signed up to the Glasgow targets. Is that the reason for 2021?
No. The reason we started in 2021 is that we had a discussion in 2020 as a team of collaborators to kick it off. So we actually formally started this project under the Morrison government, and at that stage there was a different set of targets for the Australian Commonwealth. We set a target for starting from 2020 and going in a straight line to 2050 domestically, and for our exports starting in 2030 and going to 2060, because our main export customers have 2060 targets, not 2050 targets. It just turned out serendipitously that our 2020 to 2050 straight line for the domestic system was similar to the Albanese government's adopted target when they came in.
Okay, thank you. Professor McConnell, can I ask you some questions in relation to the open data and open source point you made in your opening statement? Mm-hmm. Last week we had the three regulators in AEMO, AEMC and the Australian Energy Regulator, and they at various stages set out the information and the parts of the process that are made public. In terms of the open data, what's the data that you need to see in addition to that, given that, at least at a very first blush level, it looks like there's an enormous amount of their process data that's already available publicly? Yeah,
that's correct, and that's a good point. And actually AEMO is, I guess, very good at making a lot of their data publicly available, particularly their market data. I was actually involved in setting up a project called OpenNEM that makes that more publicly available, incidentally. So there's two points to this. One is that having the data available is one thing. Having it actually in a useful format that is other analysts and other stakeholders can engage with is another thing. You typically may need specialist software to access some of this stuff, or it's available in poor or proprietary formats. So, yeah, there's a distinction to be made between having the data available and having it available in a useful format. But, yeah, particularly AEMO should be commended for the level of data they do make available. That said, there is also a lot of room for improvement in what data is made available. Particularly in the context of the ISP, they publish a lot of the input assumptions. There's workbooks and there's a lot of renewable energy traces and so on, and demand traces that you can access, but albeit not in a particularly useful format. The outputs, however, are extremely coarse, and that is something that I would personally like to see some of the outputs from their modelling process be more transparent and published. These are big data files, but in this day and age, with IT costs the way they are, that is not a particularly significant challenge in my view. And having more of the results published on the transmission or the ISP planning side of things would be a valuable thing as well. But yeah, and that is separate to being able to actually do useful things with the data, which is where the sort of open modelling sort of question and open software comes into it.
And at a simplistic level, if we're talking about open software, we're really talking about allowing members of the public to play around with the inputs or the scenarios and basically do comparisons that way.
Yeah, I would say members of the public is one group of stakeholders, but it's broader than that. It's actually also government departments. It's also other participants in the electricity market, other advocates and so on. So it's typically the dominant. It used to be the case that there were multiple models used in this process. So there was a bit of competition, let's say, or there's competitive tension between multiple model providers. I believe, when I over a decade ago when I first was looking at this, there was 2 or 3 different software. Now there is essentially one, and there are costs associated with using that, and having a more open framework opens up not just to general public. There may be interested people in the general public that want to do that, but actually a much wider range of stakeholders and other researchers as well.
Professor McConnell, are you able to give us a quick summary of the performance of Australia's coal fleet of assets currently, and whether you think that fleet will and or should continue to be operating to 2035 or 2040?
Yeah, so the performance, it's certainly something that's in recent, it's declined. Let's say since about 2016, the forced outage rate, as the term is used to describe how reliable it is, has declined since in the last. The forced outage rate has increased, which means its reliability has decreased. That said, there is sort of evidence and data that suggests that it has actually improved in the last 12 months. So we may have reached a sort of nadir in declining performance. That said, these are aging assets. Their announced retirement dates are. I think it's 70% of coal capacity will be expected to be closed based on announced retirement dates by 2035. If you look at what some of the projections from the market operator and other analysts, it'll be well before that, and that is not independent of some of these questions about reliability and its ability to reliably contribute to the electricity system.
And what do you think needs to happen in order to ensure that coal fleet of assets can be retired with minimal negative impacts on prices and reliability?
That's a big question.
And if you want to give us a broad brushstrokes answer here and provide additional,
well, I mean,
relevant on notice.
At a higher level, this a little bit comes to the question of the role of markets and how much we want to let the private sector decide this, and or we want to have a coordinated exit, with the government playing a role in ensuring these shut in an orderly fashion that are not disruptive to energy consumers. Look, I don't think there is I think there's a variety of answers to how you might manage this. I'm personally quite open to the idea of something like a strategic reserve, or where that you have some resources that are, you have essentially resource an insurance product that protects the electricity system and consumers against unscheduled outages and without distorting the market. But yeah, there are many different alternatives there, and yeah, it's a big question.
To take as an assumption, so we've seen an increase in the volume of renewable generation in the national energy market, and assuming that that continues to increase either at the current rate or at some rate, to the point where you've got a significant proportion of energy generated in that market through renewables, what are the challenges of introducing a nuclear power sector into a system in, let's say, the mid-2030s that is, at that stage, has a significant, perhaps more than half of its energy generated by renewable energy?
Yeah, sure. So right now, our national electricity market is at about 40%, or just below 39%, renewable generation. So that's wind, solar, and hydro. So we're not far off that 50% figure you put forward. And yeah, depending on how the next decade goes and how successful some of the policies we have, things like the capacity investment scheme or other state initiatives, then by the mid-2030s we'd be expected to have well in excess of 80, close to 90% renewable generation. And that is a difficult system for a capital-intensive asset like a nuclear power plant that economically would prefer very high capacity factors. One of the challenges that is facing coal plants today, and one of the reasons that they are under increasing economic pressure, is because of renewable energy sort of undermining their preferred profile and utilisation rates as well as prices, and you would expect the same dynamics for something like a nuclear power plant in 10 plus years from now. They will, how they interact with renewable energy, it does present a challenge for their economic viability.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I've just got one quick one. I'll just give our next witnesses a heads up that we might be a few minutes late. Okay, then I'll try and wrap it up pretty quickly. Dr. McConnell, in answer to a question from Senator Gosh, you talked about AEMO and the ISP being very transparent with all the data they put forward. I would agree with that. There's an enormous amount of data that goes in there as inputs. Was I correct or were you trying to say that the outputs are less transparent or less accountable? Is that because all that input goes into almost like a black box, and just a result comes out and you can't see why that result was achieved?
In a nutshell, yes. So the resolution of the data that goes in is extremely high. The resolution of the data that comes out is quite low. It's sort of annual level information as opposed to half an hour or something. Particularly if you're thinking about some of the challenges that are facing our system around, or potential challenges around difficult weeks in 2035 and so on, and understanding some of those dynamics. That's not really something you can easily explore or analyse from what is published in the results. But there's a whole range of potential outputs that are not there.
Yeah. Thank you. And that black box lack of granularity is akin to a lack of accountability for the product that is coming out. Is that fair?
That's from my perspective, that's absolutely fair.
Do you think that sort of process or that modelling would that answer the question as to why the ISP only puts forward transmission projects and not other forms of projects that should be pushed forward?
I think that's actually a high level issue in that the ISP is still notionally a transmission planning document. That's its role in a large to a large degree. It has evolved, but if you look, its origin it is a transmission planning document. So it is in some ways unsurprising that transmission is the answer that comes out of that. They have moved, they've improved their processes and considerations around the different inputs that go into that. But as a transmission planning document, the outputs and how they get used in the processes are very transmission oriented. But that's a higher level question than the detail that comes out. You could perhaps infer some of that, or you can, and people do. You can say we need to do X, or infer information from that. But you could infer more, or have more confidence in the results, or more insights if more of that was made publicly available.
Thank you. It's interesting that you look at the 2018 ISP, the 2024, and the 2018 was far less transmission oriented, or at least had other options. Do you think it's fair that our integrated system plan should go beyond just or have such a heavy transmission focus?
Well, that goes back to the roles and responsibilities question, and what is the role and point of the ISP, and if it is supposed to be a broader, larger system planning exercise, then it should absolutely go beyond transmission planning. But yeah, that is, I guess, a different role than it has historically played, and will, in my view, require some governance changes to AEMO or to the institutional settings and frameworks that within which AEMO sits, because to date that has not happened.
One last question: do you think from when it was first set up, it was set up to be independent of government and a market? Do you think the re-entry of governments, particularly state governments, and how they're directing different projects to happen, do you think that's having a negative impact on the planning process and on the transition's potential success?
It's certainly having. Well, where I see this is not so much a negative or positive question, but an accountability question, and who is responsible for decisions made and things that are taken into account in these processes. Those lines of accountability are a bit blurred, and there is some role confusion, and there's sort of this issue of AEMO reflecting government policy and being held up as an independent source of advice, when in actual fact it may be just reflecting decisions made, government decisions. That in itself is not necessarily a bad thing, but except for this sort of accountability and transparency point where it's held up as an independent system planner when it is actually very much doing planning activities for different jurisdictions.
An important point, very well made, Dr McConnell. Thank you. I thank both witnesses for appearing today. Sorry,
Chair. And sorry, Dr McConnell, I didn't get time to ask you questions, but thank you for your submission. Just quickly to Professor Brer, if he's still on the line. You did mention that our energy exports could be even higher than 5 times cost, as previously found. Just asking, is there any way to summarise what are the drivers of that? Why are you potentially finding that it'll be more than 5 times?
Well, there's a lot of uncertainty along the whole bunch of the exports of clean energy supply chains. What's the future cost of large-scale solar, all the way through to the future cost of a large-scale electrolyser and so on and so forth to make green hydrogen, for example. But there's also the capital risk and the approval delays and so on. So those, I think we'd be confident to say that the costs that are in the report that has been published are likely to increase as we refine our modelling, due to a bunch of different factors, Senator.
Okay. Thanks, Chair. Thank you. Thanks again, Professor.
Thank you. I thank our witnesses for your evidence today. The committee has set Tuesday, 12 November 2024 as a due date for answers to questions taken on notice, if there were any. Thank you.
Thank you.
I now welcome representatives of Energy Consumers Australia via video conference. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to Senate committees has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, will you please state your full names and the capacity in which you appear today? Good morning, or afternoon now. Can you hear us?
Yes, we can. Can you hear us, Chair?
Yes, I can.
Yeah. Good. My name is Brendan French. I'm the CEO of Energy Consumers Australia.
My name's Liz Stevens and I'm the General Manager of Public Affairs and Strategy here at Energy Consumers Australia.
Thank you.
If you can hear me, I'm the Luddite in the room. Mr Chair, Michael Shaper, I'm the Chair of the Energy Consumers Australia, desperately trying to see why the system won't allow me to unlock the actual screen itself so as to be visible.
We can certainly hear you, so welcome. If you manage to sort out your video, we'll look forward to seeing you as well.
Thank you.
Does anyone have an opening statement to make?
I do, which is a little bit awkward given you can't see me, but I'll keep it short if I can, Mr Chairman. So thank you for the opportunity to present today. I'm Michael Shaper. I'm the Chair of Energy Consumers Australia, as I mentioned, and as also previously introduced to you, we have our CEO, Dr Brendan French, and our General Manager of Public Affairs and Strategy, Liz Stevens. I'll keep this short because I realise time is of the essence here, but a couple of quick points that we would like to make at the outset. And in doing so, of course, obviously also acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, traditional custodians of the ACT and the parliamentary precincts as well, and recognise their connection to the lands in which this is taking place. A quick overview of us and where we sit. We're the independent national voice for residential and small business energy consumers. We were set up in 2015 to promote the long-term interests of both Australian residential households and the small business community, to decision makers and industry, to regulators, to government, to the other players in the energy sector as well. We're structured as an independent, not-for-profit organisation, and that independence is fairly integral to our ability to provide evidence and input into the processes in which we're involved. We're funded by levies paid for by consumers within the NEM states. It is a passingly small amount. It equates to much less than 1%. It is approximately 0.03% of an average household electricity bill, or that is to say about 66 cents in the average bill. And that hasn't changed effectively in the 10 years or so since our inception. Back in 2015, it was 65 cents. In the bill today, it is 66 cents. That leaves us with a budget approximately of about $9.5 million. In 23-24 financial year, we had a $9.6 million budget, $2.6 million of which went to grants that we fund for external parties, and leaving us with about $7 million to operate an organisation with 25 staff. We run a very lean entity. We seek simply to break even, and in comparison to the other players within the sector, especially in the decision-making processes of government and regulatory frameworks, it is passingly small to have 25 staff compared to the resources available elsewhere. We have a 5-member board that I chair, it's selected by an independent panel under the auspices of the Energy and Climate Change Ministerial Council. Happy to go into governance issues later on in more detail if needs be. We also have under our constitution a reference committee, which is an advisory group of consumer and small business bodies. Our major focus is research into small business and consumer issues, engaging in the issues, in the processes, including meeting with industry, government and regulatory bodies, making submissions as issues are raised, funding work of other organisations, including grants, as I mentioned before, and working collaboratively with those other organisations to promote the needs and interests of both consumers and small businesses. And that can be a fairly diverse group of other parties, ranging from councils of social services, peak small business bodies, and a cohort of others as well. And we're also trying to build the capability of other voices within the consumer and small business space. We're unique in that, to the best of my knowledge, Australia is the only country that has specifically made provision for a national voice for consumers and small businesses within the overarching frameworks and decision-making processes. No other advanced developed economy has done that, and we think that makes an important contribution. It's one of the few countries in the world where you have a national consumer body that can actually provide a full picture when it comes to this most complex policy area, which is energy area. We're one of only a handful of bodies that also provides research funding so as to ensure that consumer and small business expectations, needs, behaviours in the market are researched and understood, and that information is made available wherever possible publicly. And we also provide that independent expertise to all the other players in the sector about this most complex area. Finally, we're also the only body that actually has a small business ambit, and they are one of those other cohorts that might be often overlooked, but to whom there is a real significance and sometimes a real difficulty in getting access, even though it's one of the primary input costs today for most small businesses. I can go into more detail about it, but given, Mr Chairman, the time in which you've got available, we might be happy to defer quickly to questions. I'd just say, in closing, we've already provided with the committee with a copy of our 2025 to 28 strategic plan, which lays out where our focus over the next 3 years. But as I said, we're happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much. That is most helpful. Some questions around the need for ECA, if I may. We just heard from Dr McConnell before about AEMO and the whole energy planning regulation model, including the 3 market bodies, is very good at being transparent, but it's not very good at being accountable. Was that lack of accountability one of the reasons or a driver for ECA to be stood up?
That, I think we're speaking back to the past. I might see if my colleagues have anything to add to that, but I think you've probably got me at a bit of a loss there, Mr Chairman, in the sense that in the 10 years since we've been there, there has been some turnover, so I'm not really fully conversant with the originating history of the entity. I don't know if Dr French has got anything he wants to add to that.
Thank you, Michael. Mr Chairman, I can give you a little background, if you like, to the establishment of ECA. There's a couple of reasons, I think, that it was deemed that there needed to be an expert voice for consumers to represent not just consumer experience, but also the standing of consumers in decisions that affect them with regard to energy. As you know very well, it's a deeply complex and sometimes quite arcane area filled with economists and engineers, and so it's very hard for consumer advocates to engage with a lot of the policy work the governments, market bodies, regulators and others engage in. And so it was deemed that there needed to be a body with sufficient resourcing and technical know-how to be able to represent the consumer voice and also to be able to turn to consumer organisations and build their capacity to engage in those processes, so as to be sort of an intervening body. The other thing, of course, is 10 years ago, the NEM was gathering steam. There was a knowledge that there was going to be very considerable changes coming in the energy system, as we've seen, and so it would be good to have a foundational consumer voice available to represent their interests.
Thank you. It's on the public record, but one of the key drivers for this inquiry was the fact that while the Senate can call Australian Energy Regulator to Senate estimates, we can't call AEMO or AEMC to Senate estimates. And so there is no pathway for those organisations, particularly AEMO with its huge planning authority and the enormous amounts of investments that it drives forward. Without that accountability, consumers can't have much of a view about how that work is being done on their behalf. Would you agree?
I would say ECA's perspective on this is that we're fortunate to be able to engage with AEMO and the other market bodies quite regularly. I meet with them every month, every couple of months, and as the committee may well know, we've been invited by Commonwealth and jurisdictional ministers to attend the Energy and Climate Change Ministerial Council. This gives us the opportunity to represent the interests of consumers, to articulate the particular issues that consumers are facing at that time, to illustrate the change in sentiment or attitudes, behaviours, impacts on consumers. Chairman, you may know that we have conducted a very extensive range of surveys now for the entire decade that we've been in existence, and that information we provide to the market bodies and others to feed into their considerations. And so from our perspective, we engage very closely with the market bodies, and we've got very good relationships. And when it comes to the ISP that you mentioned, we provide submissions to, as you know, the ISP has grown in scope and consideration over the years. We believe it's a good document, and in fact, many of the organisations that we talk with internationally feel that it's among best in class. There are elements that we know AEMO and governments are looking to extend the aegis of that report, and I heard you mention earlier in the hearings today, Chair, that there might be value in having the ISP represent a broader whole of system consideration rather than its historical focus on generation and transmission, and we support that. So we feel that there's a lot of discussion of the work that AEMO, AMC and the AR do, and certainly their engagement with consumer bodies has historically been strong.
Thank you. As far as I'm aware, I don't believe that there is in any other energy markets around the world a market operator that also has the role as central planner. You said you compared against other jurisdictions. Can you name any that do it that way?
Not in terms of central planning, Chair, more with regard to the picture that the ISP document gives of the next 20, 25 years. I think as a document it's very helpful for people to be able to perceive what planning opportunities exist over the next generation, and we would like to see the document broadened to include, for example, elements regarding the distribution network and also consumer energy resources to give a broader whole of system insight. Because, as you say, it is hard for consumers and consumer organisations to really be able to engage with some of this because it is a highly technical domain.
Thank you. And you mentioned the ISP comes out of its historical transmission planning background. We're now at the sixth ISP, fourth ISP over 6 years. Yet it's still focusing on transmission almost entirely. As energy consumers, are you not concerned that we're not getting a whole of system view out of this planning process?
Certainly we think that a whole of system view is in everyone's best interest, consumers, decision makers and others.
Just one last question. In your role, and you say you get to you get to put questions to them, etc. I don't remember seeing any. And this is a genuine question. Do you publish any reports on ECA's view of AEMO's performance, how the transition's rolling out, how we are bringing down emissions, or any other measurement or accountability on behalf of consumers?
Chairman, our focus, as you might expect, is very much on consumer experience, particularly with regard to supply, affordability, reliability and so on. Our role really isn't to critique the market bodies or to provide sort of performance assessment of their work. I imagine that's more a matter for government and others.
But those roles happen. Every energy company does that role. There's lots of bodies that do that role, fair trading, etc. I would have thought you were in the unique position to take a much more critical eye over what's happening on behalf of energy consumers.
We are very actively engaged in conversations with market bodies and governments and others, and as you mentioned, Chairman, we do a lot of work when it comes to reports and submission writing and providing an empirical data set for decision makers to use so that they can ensure that the decisions they make have all the best reference they can manage to consumer interests. This is something that we take very, very, very seriously. As you would be aware, and as Dr. Schaefer mentioned, we also provide a grants function which allows any number of organisations, whether it's academic institutions, individual practitioners, community organisations, advocacy bodies and others to examine their place in the energy system and to provide input into network resets and retailer price discussions and government and market body policies. And so we provide a broad range of services to enable that conversation to occur.
I'm sure you do. Senator Canavan.
Thank you, Chair. Can I ask first, I think you're doing some work on, I think you mentioned, doing some work on small businesses, the cost of electricity small businesses, particularly I think you've got something called a small business tariff tracker. Could you just outline what that work is and what the results of it show? I mean, have electricity prices for small businesses increased over the last couple of years?
Dr. Draper, I'm happy to take that question, if you wish. Yes, you're right, Senator. We do quite a lot of work with small businesses across a variety of engagements. One that we have historically done is focus on the retail price that small and medium enterprises pay for their energy usage, electricity and gas. And what this does is it allows a sort of a longitudinal view of published energy prices that small businesses pay. And what that has shown is in line with the rest of the consumer segments, prices have gone up over the last number of years, particularly in that period in and around the middle of 2022 when we saw prices spike in the markets.
What's sort of been the rough average increases for small businesses, let's say, in the last 2 years?
Well, it depends on jurisdiction, so it depends on state and the nature of the contracts that are used. What we have access to, Senator, is published prices. Now, of course, as you know, consumer bodies, whether they're households in the retail market or small businesses, can negotiate their own contracts, and also there are many suppliers to whom they can go for better deals. What we have seen is something in the order, depending on jurisdiction, of a sort of 8 to 20% increase over the last 2 to 3 years. Again, state by state, the circumstances differ.
It was 8% nationally last year.
8% last year.
8% increase for small businesses last year, but that's the underlying price. It doesn't take into account the rebates and other things that can influence energy prices that the small businesses actually see.
Yes.
I've just got some figures that I think came from you, reported by the Daily Telegraph recently. It shows in New South Wales under essential, and if you're with essential energy, a 38% increase. If you remove Endeavour, a 52% increase. This is over the 2 years I asked you for. South East Queensland, 49% increase. Is that right? Are these figures, is that about right? Because they're different from what I've just heard.
Well, I guess I was speaking in regard to the state-by-state experience rather than a retailer-by-retailer experience. We can provide further detail from the tariff rate.
Okay, maybe on notice if you could. If you could do that on notice. Last week we heard from the head of AEMO that he can't guarantee that power prices will fall, which is a little news to us who have heard constantly that the transition is going to be cheaper, better, everything, but apparently prices aren't coming down. I mean, the prices, the increases we've seen last couple of years are, I suppose, reflective of that. Why, in your view, isn't the transition leading to lower prices?
Again, I'm happy to take that question unless others wish to. I wouldn't necessarily make a connection between transition and high prices in every instance. As you know very well, the power bill that people receive is what's sometimes called a cost stack. So there are multiple elements that sit within it across the entire value chain of the industry. So whether that's generation or transmission, network, retail, and so on. And what we're finding is that quite commonly, if prices in one part of the market go down, they often go up in others, and quite commonly also outside of the control of decision makers. And what we would say in terms of the prices that consumers are facing is that there's real value in ensuring that at the high end, at the network end, everything is done to try to ensure that locational signals and congestion relief are considered in decisions affecting the establishment of generators. But when it comes to networks, that there's full utilisation of the network before it is augmented. And we've done some work with University of Technology in Sydney to assist the regulator and others to determine the right kind of metrics to ensure that the network companies are using all of their infrastructure and their assets to the best possible outcome. When it comes to retail, we've been pleased to see governments across the country focused through a recent consumer reform package on ways to ensure that retail contracts don't continue to sort of ratchet up step by step, and that in fact there are ways of trying to control some of the costs that people pay because, as you would know, for some time the focus has been very much on consumers going out and switching and getting a better deal. So the exertion has been very heavily placed on consumers to get into the market and get a better deal, but not all consumers can. And so it's important, we think, that from a retail perspective, work is put in by governments and others to make sure that the prices people are paying are reasonable and fair, and that people in exposed circumstances aren't paying more than their fair share. And then the final element that we think is important is energy efficiency at the home, because obviously the most expensive energy is wasted energy. And a lot of Australians live in homes that could certainly do with energy efficiency upgrades. And so we're pleased to see a number of the jurisdictions focusing on that at the moment. So they're the sort of the big four elements that we think need focus in order to consistently bring prices down.
Can I just ask you, you've got a report, just changing tack. There's a report I've seen on your website about cost-reflective network tariffs. It's titled Cost-Reflective Network Tariffs Aren't Very Cost-Reflective. And this is about apparently, or focuses on a proposed rule change by the Australian Energy Market Commission that would allow retailers to change the retail price structure of their customers without their consent. You go on to say that, and I quote from the report, that an underlying assumption driving this potential rule change is that there is a strong and necessary case for transferring every household and small business to a cost-reflective network usage tariff, even if the retailer doesn't pass it on. We believe this assumption warrants re-evaluation. That's the end of the quote. Can I just ask it, why have you got problems with this rule change? What are the issues?
Well, to be clear, Senator, the rule change that the AEMC is proposing is to disallow retailers to mandatorily or unilaterally move people into cost-reflective or time-of-use tariffs. So at the moment, at a certain point, if someone comes to your door and changes your old analogue meter to a smart meter, at the same time, you might find that the nature of your bill and pricing changes because the new smart meter allows the retailer to determine prices based on the time of day. What we're suggesting is that that's not necessarily in everyone's best interest, certainly not until consumers have the opportunity to determine how readily they're able to shift their demand, to shift their usage across the day. So, some consumers, particularly, for example, those who work from home, or people who can shift their usage from peak times to off-peak times, they might find that a time-of-use tariff is better for them. But we also are aware that there are large cohorts of the community who can't shift their load, who've got to wash the kids after school, who've got to make dinner, who've got to get up and have showers in the morning, and who can't move their load across the day terribly effectively. And what that means is if they're paying more for peak pricing, overall they might pay more. So we're pleased that the AEMC has said we're not going to unilaterally shift you to time-of-use pricing. What they've said is that there'll have to be a minimum period of 3 years in which consumers can't be shifted automatically to this new tariff regime, and that in that period of time consumers will be given enough information to determine what the best tariff and pricing structure for them is.
Just my final question, Chair, another topic. Just another report that you've released recently in the last few months, titled Power Up, Consumer Voices in the Energy Transition. You conclude in this report that there is misinformation and even disinformation, apparently, that's preventing people from supporting the transition. You identify here that, quoting, nearly all consumers had heard or seen at least one negative piece of information. The most commonly reported were negative environmental health impacts of wind and solar farms. Are you concluding that Are you saying that negative information about wind and solar farms is a form of mis or disinformation?
What we're saying, Senator, is in the absence of broader information, there is a lot of uninformed speculation that's occurring. We actually recently conducted a set of surveys of over 4,000 consumers, households and small businesses, to ask them where they get their energy information from and what do they know, what don't they know. We were quite taken with some of the results. For instance, 49% of households and 59% of small businesses said to us that they had no recollection of hearing, reading or seeing anything about energy in the previous 12 months.
Sorry, I've got limited time because the chair is wrapping me up. My question didn't go to that. My question went to, do you think, because you haven't put in your report here, unless you can point to me otherwise, you didn't and haven't put the caveats you've just placed on it to us. Your report says, and I directly quoted it, that one piece of negative information was negative environmental or health impacts of wind and solar farms. That's under a heading titled misinformation or disinformation. Now, Mr French, I have many, many constituents who aren't too happy about pristine wilderness in their backyards being destroyed by wind turbines. These are industrial. These wind turbines are 100 metres taller than the flag in this building, and they're going into areas of pristine environmental wilderness. I'm working with conservation groups, believe it or not, about this. Now, I would suggest, unless you can point me otherwise, your report is an example of misinformation, because you're trying to suggest here there are no negative impacts of wind farms, which is clearly wrong. Now, you could have a different opinion that the balance, that we need to destroy these pristine wilderness places because we have to do this transition. But you've broadly stated here that information saying there's negative environmental impacts of wind farms is misinformation. That is itself clearly misinformation. They do impact the environment. They do destroy large parts of our pristine wilderness. They do destroy the habitats of koalas, of sugar gliders and other beautiful things in this country. And so play me on notice. I don't know if you've got a response to me, but I noticed could you identify in your report where you've actually outlined that the legitimate views of some people to protect our natural environment are worthy of consideration and debate in this country.
I'm happy to come back.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Senator Gosh.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for our witnesses for being here today. I'd like to go back to one of the answers that was given a few minutes ago in relation to the increases or the number that was cited in relation to small business cost of energy. Now, I understood that answer as the increase was stated, but it didn't include rebates and government energy relief measures. That's right, isn't it?
That's correct, yes.
And my understanding is that once you take into account those rebates and energy relief measures, the energy prices for small businesses have not gone up. Is that right?
One thing I'd say, Senator, is the relief you're talking about, if I'm correct, mostly has occurred in the last year. The first year of the energy rebate program was predominantly at a consumer end, at a household's end, and less so for small businesses, which is why I was unsure about the 2-year time frame. We will come back to you with sort of quite careful detail by retailer and by state to cover both of those.
That would be great. And if you are able to provide that number in relation to, or your analysis, if you have it, in relation to nominal and real cost of energy to small businesses in that period, including government energy relief measures and small business rebates as well. I think you're providing something to Senator Canavan on that as well. Now, in relation to the cost-reflective tariff issue, can I just check, has the ECA's position on that changed over time, given your answer today?
The point, I guess, that we've made with this report, Senator, is we don't think that it's in consumers' interests to be mandatorily shifted to a tariff model that might disadvantage some cohorts of consumers, particularly quite vulnerable consumers in some circumstances, without their choice and without them having sufficient historical data in order to make best decisions between offers from retailers. And so that's why we're pleased that what the ANC has now proposed is to give enough time for consumers to be informed in the interim for them to be able to remain on a flat tariff rather than to be unilaterally shifted. We do think that consumer choice is quite critical in this regard.
And so you're supportive of that rule change for that reason?
Yes, we are.
Okay. What are the consumer protections that are currently being developed in this space? I take it from your answer there that you think there is a need for better consumer protections, but what's currently being done?
There are consumer protections that are in place at present for consumers, for households and small businesses. We do think that sometimes the jurisdiction of those bodies needs to be more comprehensive and more consistent from one state to another. Then consumers have ready access to an energy ombudsman from most of the mainland states, certainly all the NEM states, but not all the ombudsmen have got the same jurisdiction, and critically, they don't all have the same capability to respond at more cutting-edge issues. So, for example, for consumer energy resources, if I went and put a solar panel on my roof and a battery on my house, or I went and bought an electric vehicle, there's no guarantee that all of the activities that go into purchasing, installing, checking standards and so on of those would be captured by the jurisdiction of an ombudsman. In some instances, I might have to go to a fair trading jurisdiction, to the Commonwealth Ombudsman, to a government body, to a court or others. And we think that in the context of the energy transition, it's critically important that consumers have got fairly much a one-stop shop for dispute resolution. That's why we support the energy ombudsman having consistent and strong jurisdiction to respond to these newer energy challenges.
Thank you. My colleague, Senator Canavan, referred to a report in which you had suggested that there was disinformation in certain contexts, and you answered some of his questions in relation to that. Are you able to just provide, by way of summary, some examples of the disinformation that was identified?
I'm happy to, Senator, and perhaps I can articulate some of those for you when I come back to the committee on notice with some examples and the kinds of things that we've seen. The important thing I have to emphasise is that we try to step wherever we can in the shoes of consumers. So this is when we survey consumers, when we talk to consumers and their representatives and advocacy organisations, consumer community organisations across the country. It's the consumers who are saying to us, we don't know entirely what's true and not, what's good and not, how I can make the best decision for myself and my family or not. And so for us, we think this work was done within the context of suggesting from a policy perspective, we think there's real value in ensuring that consumers can go to a one-stop shop to get reliable information on a whole variety of things. How to get the best energy contract, how to know which installer to go to or not to install solar on my roof, where I can go to get my EV charge, how I can get my concession on my retail account, all of these kinds of things. When we ask consumers, a concerningly large number say that they don't know where to go for that information and it's not readily available. I should say that a number of the states and territories are commencing really good work in this regard. So the ACT, Victoria, New South Wales Consumer Energy Strategy just released a month ago all point to what they're calling sort of one-stop shops, a place that consumer can go to get good, reliable, concise, clear information when they need it. We think that this assists confidence in the transition, and also it's a good service to consumers to make sure that when they're making energy decisions, they're doing so with the best sort of personal economics, but also the best understanding of the circumstance and planning for the future for their family and their business.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Senator Canavan's got a follow-up question, then I have one, and then we'll break for lunch.
Oh, you want to go me first? Sorry.
Sure.
Just quickly, just on this misinformation report, did you identify any misinformation about nuclear energy?
This report didn't address nuclear energy at all, Senator Canavan.
Really? I mean, I've seen members of this government put out, the Minister for Energy put out a tweet once using an AI-generated image of nuclear waste in rusty yellow barrels. It was the most ridiculous thing you've ever seen. I've seen three-eyed fish. I mean, I hate the word misinformation, but if you're going to focus on it, you're telling me you did not at all look at the information spread about nuclear and whether that was true or false.
Has to be the important thing, Senator, to recognise this report was done. Was based on surveys of consumers done some time ago, and before perhaps the conversation about nuclear options gathered pace. But also it was
published in July this year, wasn't it?
Senator Canavan,
Yeah.
the report that you're referring to relates very specifically to consumer energy resources. That's batteries, solar power and EVs. We didn't look at anything outside of those. So everything in there that the report relates to consumer energy resources.
It seems that it reads just like a defence of the government's policy. I mean, you're meant to be on the side of consumers, but all I've heard from you today is running defence for what clearly is a transition that's failing customers by having higher prices. How in all are you actually representing the interests of Australian consumers rather than running propaganda for the government?
Well, the report actually...
I'm not referring to the report now, I'm just overall. Overall, it seems to me you're more interested in being very defensive about the government's energy agenda rather than genuinely being on the side of consumers.
Well, Senator, what I'd say is we start from an empirical basis and we look to the economics for a consumer and what is in their best interest, and the reports that we've published start from the basis of what I, as a consumer, how I can make the best decisions for myself and my family, and particularly with regard to price. And so we've published reports, which I'm hopeful you've seen, that speak to the benefits from a consumer's point of view.
Can I just clarify this? Because I'm getting confused now. I thought your role, and I used to be on the Ministerial Council of Energy, I thought your role was to advise governments and policymakers about the best interests, be an advocate for consumers. But you just told me is your primary role now to tell consumers how to change their behaviour, because you said to help consumers make decisions. I thought you were actually meant to be an advocate for them in the room, in the decision-making room.
We are an advocate for them.
Right.
Senator, that is our primary
Just
role.
a bit confused what you're actually doing then to achieve that. But anyway, all right, we've run out of time. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Mr French, I'll put it to you, but you might want to go to your chairman. As the advocate for consumers, when you see projects, large transmission projects like HumeLink, when you see over a short number of years a cost of that project go from 1.5 to 3 to $5 billion, when you're in that room that was just talked about, what do you say to whether it be the AEMO or the Energy Minister? What is your gut reaction when you see those numbers?
I'm just checking.
I'll make a couple of introductory comments, Mr Chairman, and nice to be able to, you can see me again at long last. Apologies again for that. We don't condone waste, and we don't think that we're not advocates of expenditure that isn't necessary. But those are operational management goals that we don't have the forbearance over. We don't have the oversight of them. Which is not to say that we don't, we obviously believe that a more efficient system is a more cost-effective one for consumers.
But aren't you outraged? Every consumer that you represent would be outraged if they knew that, or were aware of, that projects that have a utility, understood, but then the price just keeps on doubling or nearly doubling. On your behalf, you should be outraged, shouldn't you?
Well, if I can jump in, Chair. Mr Chairman, we're heavily focused on necessary investment only occurring at the right time at minimal cost to ensure bills are maintain at the lowest level imaginable. Now, that may sound like a platitude, it's not. We work very hard with bodies to actually represent the consumer interest, to make it very clear the impact of high costs on consumers and their lives, their families, their businesses. And this is very much the focus of what we do. But as Dr. Shepherd mentioned, we don't have control over project costs or any others with regard to...
No, but you're an advocate for the users. You should be advocating for the users. Do you put out a newsletter when that happens and say, these costs have blown out this way, and this much, but here's why we think it's okay? Because I don't think you'd get a very good response if you did.
What we do, Senator, is to note quite clearly that we feel there should be no investment that is not critically required at the time at which it's required. And this has historically been our focus. We have a newsletter, we have publications which, as you know, we've made those points quite clear.
It sounds like you're, without wanting to be derogatory, just rubber stamping things, because if you go to this committee's website and look at the submissions that we've received, you'll see a lot of criticism and detailed critique about why such cost blowouts are out of order and ultimately make these projects useless and damaging to consumers. I'll leave it there.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just, I know you're finishing up the end, I'd just make a concluding comment. The challenge of being a very small, almost a micro organisation, trying to represent the needs of more than 11 million households and 2.5 million businesses means that by necessity there are some things we deal with, and there are a wide variety of different, as you were just saying in the debate now, about what issues we should focus on and which ones we shouldn't have. We try to do the best within our resources to make sure that the critical issues, which to us are reliability and price, as consumers want them, are the ones that we focus on. So I appreciate your point very much, but needs must so that we cannot address everything.
A $9 million a year organisation can certainly address enormous and unwarranted cost blowouts in one of the key projects that you're representing consumers in. I don't accept that. I think if that's what you're saying to this committee, it may behove you and the board to look at your priorities again.
We have a fairly clear constitutional framework as to where our priorities must be. So I appreciate your thoughts. That would obviously necessarily, as respectfully, it's $9.5 million, but as we pointed out, $2.5 million of those go in grants to other parties. So that leaves us with $7 million. It's not a vast amount, and we're not an infrastructure regulator or monitor. That would be a vast set of new tasks for us to take on.
Well, if there was real accountability in the system, then I would have thought that AEMO might share some of their hundreds of millions of dollars with you. Anyway, on that, we will go to lunch break. Do you gentlemen need a full hour, or should we come back a little bit sooner? Do? No problem?
Well,
okay.
Sorry, if we keep to the current schedule.
We'll keep to the current schedule then. The committee will stand adjourned and we will return at 1:45. Cool.